Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Enterprise Dish. We are hanging out with Aaron once again, who I was actually going to be curious to see if he showed up in the office today because all of my Seattle friends, all they're posting is the snowmageddon that has taken over that region. But clearly you've survived.
It's unbelievable. And, like I said in the last episode, I grew up in Minnesota and I love skiing. And so snow is great for me. I'll take as much of it as I can get. However, Seattle is not at all prepared for any of this that's happened. And so it has been insane. And I still am sort of baffled. And what's even more challenging is in classic Seattle form, the snow stopped and it started raining. And so we got, a bunch of rain on top of 8 to 12 inches of snow. And it went crazy. But the nice thing is it did wash a lot of the snow away and things are getting back to normal slowly but surely.
Well, that's good. I was curious to see if this was still going to be on track. People are talking about not being able to move their cars. And, and Seattle's a relatively hilly area, too. And the joke is that there's 2 snowplows in the city.
It's not far from the truth. It really is treacherous, though. There are places where it is not safe. It is downright scary. I don't care what you're driving and how big your tires are and how big the chains or studs are that are on your wheels. You are going to go for a heck of a ride. And so it can get quite serious, and there are all kinds of accidents all over the place, and people running into snowplows, right? We're renting a snowplow just because they're not used to being on the road, and oh man, it's crazy. But it is getting back to normal. You can see rooftops again, and it's not just all white, which is sort of sad because it is peaceful and happy and fun and all that. But the entire country. I should save this for the end, but the entire country is getting even more snow now.
Yeah.
Midwest, East Coast, in the West, we're supposed to get more later in the week, and it's going to keep going, which is cool in a way.
Yeah. Keeps things interesting. If you've ever said I'm too stuck in my ways, toss a little snow in there.
Absolutely.
That'll mix things up. But speaking of mixing things up, as we are going to be doing here, yesterday was Patch Tuesday, or I should say possibly 2 days ago, depending on when this podcast goes live. But Microsoft issued 77 security flaws, or fixes to fix 77 security flaws. But the one I wanted to point out and kind of talk about here is there was one 0 day that relates to Internet Explorer. Now, Internet Explorer is a legacy product, I think, at this point. And so 2 questions or maybe points of thought for you. What are you seeing in the corporate world about Internet Explorer usage? Because obviously this is only going to impact people currently who are using Internet Explorer because it says you have to actually navigate to a malicious website. But Microsoft says they have seen this in the real world, so this is an active exploit. But
Sure. I think the reality is Internet Explorer, at least as far as I see it, and I think a lot of our customers see it, is not a legacy product. It's an everyday productivity necessity. There are still so many line of business apps that run on it. I think a lot of people, don't think of it as in the past tense at all.
Yeah.
And by a lot of people, I mean tens to hundreds of thousands of people every day. Probably millions, actually, if we're being honest. So, this notion that it's sort of dead or going away, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. But it's, it underscores the problem that it needs to.
Sure.
Right? It is old. I don't think Microsoft wants to keep supporting it if they don't have to. But it goes back to the same problem of everyone having written their LOB apps and needing to continue to run their LOB apps and keep the business running, and not having either the justification or the time or the budget to be able to overhaul everything in a timely way, or just the staff, right? And I think a lot of our listeners can probably relate to that. Like, hey, we've got a backlog of 50 projects, and those one apps that are running on IE are like, priority N. Like we're that's the last thing we're thinking about. They're running fine. The servers are running are stable. They have virtualized, or we're dealing with the services and whatever. They're not necessarily worrying about the medium in a sense, if that makes sense. I don't know. Like, long story short, this is something that people still have to be concerned about. Microsoft still has to be concerned about. We as IT people have to be very concerned about it because the risk is certainly high. But with this one, what I read anyway was that you can give yourself some protection by just managing your passwords well, right? I mean, am I thinking about the right one? Did you read this too? That a strong password will greatly diminish the risk of compromise.
Yep.
So the take-home message, I think, for listeners is, use complex passwords. Just do all the right things you're supposed to do with passwords, as most of us do. Use a very nice enterprise quality password management app or tool. We use a couple different ones here, and not necessarily by design, sort of de facto ended up being two different tools, but it's been really, really handy and makes life easier, and always ensures that you're using super strong passwords that are stored in an encrypted file, and on and on and on and on. And that's going to, kind of give you a safer starting point and decrease the risk of some of these things, and maybe buy you the time to do a little more testing on these updates, and, on and on and on. Do all the things you're supposed to do. Easier said than done sometimes, but that's the idea.
Password managers are one of those things that even in my personal life I've started using, and it's something. If you're listening to this, and especially in the corporate world or even a small business, and you haven't used a password manager, it's very much worth the investment, because as Aaron is saying, it gives you not only better security, but just the management of that process becomes so much easier.
It's crazy. For me, when I started using, I was a skeptic, I guess. I was dubious, because you go to all these trade shows and everyone gives you their tchotchkes, and it was all these, for a time, I can't remember the years, all these password management products, and I've got, a drink koozie and a USB keychain and, every imaginable thing from every vendor. And I was like, well, I don't know. And, this was before it became super mainstream. And I was talking to a friend, I guess. He's like, yeah, I use this one. So I started using it. And pretty soon I realized that I have so many passwords. I was doing everything wrong. I was reusing them. They were overly simple because I had to remember them. And so I just started using it and allowing the tool to generate complex passwords, and it would automatically save them. And pretty soon I had 30 or 40 of them, and there was no way I was going to keep up. So I just decided to pony up and bought 5 years right up front.
Yeah. And the thing that kind of drilled it home for me, I was with a good buddy who works in the security industry, and he pointed this out. He goes, here's the issue without using a password manager. And if you reuse passwords, and what you're hitting on, he says, if you reuse a password, any database that gets cracked, you are now exposed across an infinite level, because of that's duplicated across all those different products. So maybe you forgot that you had a Target account, or maybe you forgot that you had a Sears account, but you use that password. The first thing that happens is people robot attack everything with those credentials to see what pops. And so that idea of using a password manager just mitigates that whole issue. And in the corporate world, it makes it easier for when you have new employees onboarding. You don't have to share all the credentials. You can make life easier.
You got it. Exactly. And so, and then another aspect of this, I think, was that I can't remember if it was this 0-day exploit or another similar recent one. Basically, once you were compromised, the bot would look for files that would contain passwords, and then it would use those passwords on everything. So it's looking for your poor practices and exploiting those poor practices to take advantage of anything you have. And it kind of reminds me of, this is more of a consumer example, but some months ago, Google issued this warning about Nest products. And like, our products are not inherently unsafe, but you should make sure that you do this right, because here's what can happen. And they cited some examples of someone getting someone's Nest password and basically screaming vulgarities at them spontaneously in their living room, right? Because they had things piped into their TV or whatever. But it's those kinds of things, consider that people can see you, and all of the things that we use passwords for now, especially as IT people, right? A lot of times IT is in charge of security systems and physical security systems, like your buildings, a card key system and things like that. And so if you're starting to do some of these things just to make your life easier, that are not best practices, man, it can get gnarly fast. So
this is slightly related, but it's along the same lines, because the weakest point in most security systems is always the individual. It's not the software. The likelihood of someone exploiting a certain issue on the software to get into your server is much lower than them just asking someone for a password and getting it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And that reminds me of sort of what I tell people, especially young people who are, students or whatever, if you're talking
Hmm.
to, young people who don't really understand how hacking works,
Yep.
this realization that hacking is not about, these brute force automated attacks. Real hacks generally involve a person getting information from another person,
Yep.
either from their voice or from something that was written down by hand. That's usually where a real hardcore hack starts. And I think going
Yep.
back to the Sony hack, I think that's where
Oh
that
yeah.
started too. Someone shared a network password or something with somebody else. And
Hmm.
it wasn't, a bot, it wasn't a DDoS thing, it wasn't anything like that. It was
Yeah.
so somewhat more cultural and social, I guess. And that social cultural component, I think, is what a lot of people overlook,
Yep.
right? And that maybe is part of what these particular exploits are looking at too, is saying if you're crazy enough to leave your password in a file, in an unencrypted file on your computer, then shame on you.
Hmm.
A tool should be able to go and find that. And that's, what a good security consultant would go and do anyway, and all those things, and tell you you're doing it wrong. But, there's an easy way, easy, inexpensive way to be much, much smarter and do it right.
Yep. In a prior life, when I was working in the financial districts, one of the compliance things that we would do is we had a costume shop where we would go out to branches, but dressed up as, say, like an electrician or a contractor, put on a hard hat and all that stuff. And the goal was to try to get behind the counter, was to go up to them and say, hey, look, I'm here to do some work on your cameras or whatever. And you would be surprised at how easily people just open that little door up and just let you walk behind the cash counter. Yeah.
I'm not surprised. I am 0% surprised.
Yep.
And so all the more reason that I was talking to a consultant just the other day, a security oriented IT consultant, and he said, so much of the time what we're talking about is very, very inexpensive stuff.
Hmm.
Put a deadbolt on the store, or heck, go to your favorite hardware store and just get a padlock and put it
Yeah.
on the door, right? I mean, just put another simple barrier there. So when Brad, dressed up as an electrician, shows up and he
Hmm.
wants to start pulling cables or rearranging cables in some closet that's left
Yep.
unsecured, that happens to go to one of your important routers, it doesn't cause days of disruption and people figuring
Yep.
out what happened.
Yep. The ultimate goal, or what we called it, the prize, was if you could plug a USB drive into their computer. That was the objective. And most people would stop you from doing that, but that if you're 50% of the way there, that's too much. But that's what you were trying to do, is get behind the counter and let someone plug in a USB drive, because then the idea being that you could compromise the system and all that good stuff.
Yes, one of our very smart FedGov customers epoxies all their USB ports shut. You
Yep.
cannot access them at all, period. So
Yep.
that's another example of a fairly inexpensive hardware store IT security solution right there, right?
Yep. And a little bit of programming news. Well, not really programming news, folks, but just things you should be aware of transitioning here. Microsoft's opened up their Build conference registration. Well, they're going to on the 27th of this month. That is going to take place in May 6th through the 8th, right in Aaron's backyard in Seattle. And so if you're planning to go to that, I know we're going to be recording more than likely. I might even be in that room you're in right now.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Then.
Build's so great, and if people have event budget or conference budget, it's a very, very good one. I've not attended in person. I've helped with a bunch of content in the past, and seen tons of the sessions online, but it's really a who's who on the engineering side.
Yep.
So this isn't as much kind of the high gloss Ignite marketing event. It's very much a dev and DevOps showcase on the engineering side. So you get,
Yep.
program managers telling their story of their new services, and they're soliciting feedback on the fly in those sessions too. So it's a really cool environment to be in.
Yeah, a build is always great. If you use an application and you have a feature that you want implemented, you can go to Build and you can find someone giving a session who is an engineer on that team and just walk right up to him and be like, here's what I need.
Yeah, you could probably find the director of program management
Yep.
who's prioritizing those features and make a case for your feedback to be prioritized, and it might just happen. Like that's what's cool about Build is just the access to those, senior engineering managers, principal engineering managers, directors of PM who are calling the shots on this stuff, and you get a front row seat to say, no, dude, I'd rather have it this way, and they might say, okay. You know?
And then, Aaron, we had a question come in for you. And because I know that you work a lot with Windows and deployments over the years, the question was, how have you seen the deployment of new versions of Windows change during the past decade?
Man, it has been a lot, and short of radical, I guess, very, very impactful. And especially with Windows 10, it's become so much more painful for people. And I'll give you a number of examples. Behavior started changing, especially during the XP migration. I talked about this in our last podcast of, how app compat was a huge issue, and people had to think ahead a little bit more and try to do a better job of keeping pace. Well, with these twice yearly updates, that's been turned on its head, and this notion of keeping pace turns into this nonstop sprint. It's forcing IT to sprint along. And so, there's this the long-term channel, as they call it, what they call long-term service channel, LTSC, right, is what they call it, is attractive. And I know that Microsoft is trying to dissuade people from pursuing that, but it's very attractive because of all these things like drivers. At least every other release, at least once a year, all the drivers are going to be updated, and they may not be compatible backwards. So if you get on this twice a year update program, you don't know if your displays, I mean, this is a bit of an extreme example, but your display is going to turn on. Yeah. So how do you manage that? Group policy objects, with all the new features coming out and things, that changes everything and turns that on its head. All kinds of other examples. So, this notion that upgrades are good and upgrades are easy is really somewhat of a misnomer. So that's forcing IT's hand. Yep. And it's making it so that, the conditions under which you would use imaging or deployment or re-imaging or sort of a flatten and reload versus trying to wrench on a system more is going more toward flatten and reload. On the plus side, we make that easier, and it's less technical, and it's more turnkey. And I think that's why we're seeing, the adoption rates that we are, which is very encouraging. But it does turn the volume knob way, way up on IT and makes this a thing that everyone has to do all the time, rather than something you undertake for, specific break fix scenarios, migration scenarios, new hardware scenarios. The other big thing that's changing this is the way that we work. More virtual remote office workers, more small branch offices, home office workers. So you consider break fix in those environments. Well, what happens now, especially with these twice a year updates that are going to maybe blow up your drivers or blow up your GPOs, and then you have a potential security risk, for example. So it's become more and more complex. Devices themselves have become more complex, right? PCs have become more like mobile devices, where we have, Bluetooth radios and GPS and, cameras, maybe front and back facing, and all these, embedded devices that need even more drivers and more function keys to make those things work. And it just, spirals the complexity up. Lay on top of that all these other things that are going on. Yep. It's become a harder, more complex job, for better or worse. You'd think it'd get easier over time, or that it'd become less necessary. Almost the reverse seems to be true, really. And the nice thing is there's better tools that make it so that it's less invasive. But for myself, I prefer to stay on a platform longer, and I'm staring at an Ultrabook that's a couple years old, that is just everything's exactly the way I like it, right? So even if you migrate your settings and bring everything over, there's so much fine tuning in terms of your environment and the way that you're most productive that I don't know. It's tough. It's tough for end users and even tougher for IT. I mean, that's I guess the discouraging point.
Yep.
So increased complexity, I guess, TLDR version of this is increased complexity and precipitating a greater need to do this job more in a lot of cases. But hopefully better tools that allow that increased frequency to be accomplished with less drama and fewer kind of fist pounding, frustrating hours of figuring out a specific device or something like that, where hopefully it's more consistent as you go device to device to device, you kick it off, and or it's zero touch remote, or what we're trying to advocate for is increasing self-service, where it's turnkey enough that, either some basic, emailed instructions or instructions on your phone or something, you can kind of just light it up yourself at home and you'd be back online in 30 minutes or something over Wi-Fi from the cloud, hypothetically.
I mean, it sounds good to me. Like my biggest fret is updating this podcast box, and I don't really have a lot of control over it because I can't put long-term servicing channel on it because I don't have an enterprise license. Because it's held together delicately, I would say, just because the way I have to route the audio to be able to record all this, to be able to swap the video streams like that. And every single time Skype updates or Windows updates, it resets the audio stack that I have. And I can't, I've flattened it. I've tried different hardware. It's something within Windows, and it's always a joy every time I see that.
Right, so you do updates, and then you're wrenching for 30 minutes or an hour or more, or like an afternoon to get things running for the next day, or even better, you get your updates, you do them at the end of the day because you don't want to get disrupted at work, things fire back up, and then a bunch of stuff's broken. You have to be going the next morning, so then you spend your evening and night trying to get things back to where they should be, which is the exact opposite of the scenario that a lot of the blogosphere is talking about as the arguments against LTSC. So for me, it's sort of like, well, how all the features that come out twice a year, how important are they really? Versus us dialing in our workstations for the productivity that we do as media professionals, as business professionals, as IT professionals, in order to do the things that we need to do to keep the business running. How important is Candy Crush Saga as reinstalled default in Windows Enterprise? It doesn't make any sense, man. So there are some of those things where it's like, really, bro, it's I don't know. So a bit of a soapbox rant there, but
it happens.
What can I say? There are just some of those frustrating things, and I know that our listeners, live this every day. That you really wish, and Microsoft has their perfectly good business reasons to do it the way that they're doing it. I understand that they're dealing with epic scale that they have to accommodate a lot of people, but there's also a scale of us who are in the trenches, digging every day, and the ditch just, doesn't seem to get any wider no matter how fast and hard we dig. So,
yep, and piggybacking on that, you actually pointed this out before the show. The Windows 7, well, we know it's going to expire here in January, but if you're willing to pay, you can extend that, and that's going to be a little dicey, I think.
Right. What occurred to me, that's funny. So I hopefully people have read, but there was a leak, I think it was last week, which doesn't seem like much of a leak because it looked like a screenshot or something. But basically outlining the prices. So it starts, I think, at $25 per device per year is what I think it is.
For the first year.
First year, and then doubles every year to keep getting Windows 7 updates. And so that starts looking like Windows as a service to me, right? On some levels, right? I mean, if that's the way it's going, so that kind of struck me as in a bit of gallows humor as being funny, but that you can keep this going for a price like that might be a very, very inexpensive price for organizations to pay, because if you think about what it would take, let's say your average mid-sized bank or or mid-size healthcare network of hospitals and clinics, how many LOB apps do they have? Probably, it's probably in the teens to dozens, I would guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so how much would it cost to accelerate the migration of that, either to get, outsourcing done for those things, which is super, super expensive and painful, and then becomes a maintenance nightmare, or to do it yourself internally, right? So if you've got, say, 5,000 endpoints, so what is that divided by 4? Does that end up being, starts at 20 grand a year, goes up to 4x that, goes up to about 100 grand a year? That sounds like one person's salary to me. Sounds pretty sustainable. So, for the mid-size enterprise, probably not unrealistic. The pain is even greater for large enterprises. Even though it'd be way more expensive at the large enterprise, the problem's even orders of magnitude greater in terms of the long-term solution to get to the right next architecture platform, whatever it takes to get your LOB apps up to date. So there's not unfortunately a really great convenient answer for a lot of us. It's just open up your checkbook, because knowing that our platform is going to be supported for another 3, 4, 5 years, man, that's a huge relief for a price that I now know and can budget for as a business person. This ends up being a pretty reasonable proposition, but of course your CIO and IT managers are running the race with, the Microsoft field salespeople and Microsoft partners to try to get everything squared away and dialed in and figured out. And as I said, a lot of people have finished the job. So I don't know, how extreme the circumstances are. For the organizations that are in it, probably feels pretty extreme, but at least there's a sustainable and seemingly affordable path out, at least to start.
Yeah, and don't take this as the gospel, but I have heard that if you are in the middle of a migration, Microsoft might actually throw those Windows 7 patches to you for free. But you have to be in the migration.
Sure. And there are also some incentives, I think, for like O365 subscribers and things like that, where if you're already banging checks every month, I don't know if they give you a discount or they give you the first year free or something like that. It seems like almost like buying a car. You buy a car, your first year of satellite radio is free or something like that. So a little bit like that in kind of a funny sense. But no, I think there are lots of great alternatives and solutions for organizations still doing this battle. And the reality is, at least for the customers that we see, for many of them, I was going to say most, but at least many of them, Windows 7 is a minority of the devices that they now support. So even more to the point that, okay, if there's a group of people who have, just like your case, Brad, a special audio setup, well, you can continue to maintain that. We get it, and we'll just, pay this fee, and we've got our enterprise agreement all set up, and they know what our situation is. They're empathetic, and I'm sure that's part of the reason that this exists too. So,
well, as we wrap it up here, Aaron, there's always time for a little bit of a dish at the end. Is there anything you want to just talk about? What technology you're using? What you're seeing? What's going on?
First I wanted to say, Brad, thanks for the book.
Oh yeah, they're good book.
I don't know if listeners know, but Brad wrote a book, and it's really entertaining. It's really great. It's about Surface devices at Microsoft, and being in Seattle and seeing all this happen, the mainstream media covers all this stuff that I think most of the world sees only in the tech press. Yeah. So we got a fair amount of this dish on what's in the book, but it's pretty juicy. It's very fun. But thanks a lot for sharing that. It's still winter. We were talking about snow, and I was going to shift gears this month and talk about snow in other places. And we talked about how North America is under snow, and it is, and it's amazing. And Europe got a huge batch of it too. But the miracle of snow is in Japan. And I don't know if people know this, but northern Japan just gets tons and tons and tons of snow. And it has, these famous snowstorms that cause the trees to look like snow monsters. And there's this very charming Japanese name, as there is for everything in Japan, the trees when they get that way. But as great good fortune would turn out, right now, I believe, is the Snow Festival in Sapporo, which is just this world-class event. Millions of people turn out to see ice sculptures, and it's it's quite a spectacle. I had the great good fortune to get to Hokkaido and ski some of that famous powder and a few years ago, and it did not disappoint. And I understand that they're getting it pretty good this year too. Here, we have the polar vortex, or whatever they said.
Yeah,
you just put Minnesota's head under minus 40 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit water. I guess it's about the same when you get that cold. Mm-hmm. But in Japan, it comes from Siberia and then crosses the Sea of Japan and has almost a lake effect thing. Just multiplies the dumpage. So people like me, it is the most wonderful time of year.
Well, that's a good tip, especially if you're a ski buff. Most people don't think about going to Japan for skiing. So there you go. It's
great. The living's easy. The food's great. The people are also nice. Phones make the language barrier less of a barrier. It's easy. So especially for the traveling IT person who racks up the miles and the points, it's relatively easy to get there and get around, and surprisingly affordable. I don't know if we're jaded because Seattle's gotten so expensive, but it's not as expensive as people think either. So
good to know.
Recommended.
Good to know. Well, Aaron, we very much appreciate you stopping by, taking time out of your busy and snowy and treacherous drive to work for us. We appreciate it. And Aaron, if people want to reach out, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Email, or even better, Twitter at Aaron Suzuki is a great one. Just PM me and follow if you like. I've been a little bit sleepy on the switch on the Twitter side, but I'll get back on the Twitter machine and resume my jaded snark.
Which is the best. Jaded snark is probably the best tagline for just Twitter in general, right? That's all that it is. Well. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Don't forget to hit subscribe and do all that good stuff. We'll be back just about every single week for the remainder of the month with more Enterprise Dish content. You can always find Aaron and everything else he's doing over at SmartDeploy.com, and have yourselves a wonderful day.